Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 to e5. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to f3. Queen d8 to b6. Bishop f1 to d3. Queen b6 to d8. Bishop d3 to f1. Queen d8 to b6. Pawn b2 to b3. Queen b6 to d8. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn f7 to f6. Pawn e5 takes f6. Queen e7 takes f6. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Knight c6 takes d4. Queen d1 to h5, check. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop d3 takes g6, check. Pawn h7 takes g6. Queen h5 to d1. Queen f6 to e5, check. Knight d2 to e4. Queen e5 takes e4, check. King e1 to f1. Knight d4 to c2. Rook a1 to c1. Knight c2 to a3. Queen d1 to d4. Rook h8 to h4. King f1 to g1. Queen e4 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight a3 to b5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight g8 to f6. Rook c1 to c5. Knight b5 takes a3. Rook c5 to a5. Knight a3 to c2. Rook a5 to c5. Knight c2 takes d4. Pawn b3 to b4. Knight d4 to e2, check. King g1 to f1. Knight f6 to d7. Rook c5 takes c8, check. Rook a8 takes c8. King f1 takes e2. Rook c8 to c2, check. King e2 to e3. Rook c2 to c3, check. King e3 to d2. Rook c3 to b3. Rook h1 to a1. Pawn a7 to a6. Rook a1 to e1. Pawn e6 to e5. Rook e1 to c1. Rook h4 takes h2. Rook c1 to c8, check. King e8 to e7. Rook c8 to g8. Rook h2 takes g2. Rook g8 to g7, check. King e7 to d6. Rook g7 takes d7, check. King d6 takes d7. King d2 to e2. Pawn b7 to b6. Pawn b4 to b5. Pawn a6 to a5. King e2 to d2. Rook g2 takes f2, check. King d2 to d1. Rook b3 to b1, checkmate.